Hello, everyone. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Can everyone stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Victor Ferraro, who is here tonight. He's a freshman at Brunswick School, and he is earning a medal in community service. Is that correct, Victor? Communications. Maybe would you mind approaching the podium and telling us a little bit about what you need to do tonight?
It's one requirement of 8. Requirement number 5, I need to attend a public meeting, either like a debate, school board, or something like this. I have to take careful notes on opposing views on a certain subject and practice careful listening skills, and then report back to my counselor what it was like.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure you will both get debate and perhaps even opposing views. However, you may have to wait for a short time, as our first item of business is an executive session where only members of the board are present. Can I have a motion to go into executive session?
I second that.
Okay. The executive session has been moved by Beth Crumick and seconded by Jeff Raymer.
No, it's moved by
Mrs.
Leslie
Tarkington.
Leslie Tarkington.
Okay, thank you for the correction. Moved by Mrs. Tarkington and seconded by
Mr. Raymer.
Mr. Raymer.
So we'll summon you.
Okay, I don't see Ms. Elliott. I know she had been, is she? Ah. Okay, just in time.
Anybody have a silver Honda? It's parked in that lot. Their lights are on. Nobody here? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Oh, well, okay. Sorry for that, but I figured. Okay. Good evening, Madam Chair and fellow members of the BET. I'd like to present the assessor's report for March 2018. First and foremost, I'd like to apologize. I was out last week, so with the flu, so I was not as. I'm a couple days behind. But that being said, the Board of Assessment Appeals has completed its meetings. We've sent out all their notices to all the property owners, and we did so within the 1-week requirement we were. 1 week from their determination. At the moment, the reduction to the grand list is a little different than what it was in my report from last week. The reduction right now is $74,879,263. There's still a couple issues that we have to verify with the Board of Assessment Appeals. Hopefully we'll have this complete by tomorrow. Okay? Does anybody have any questions for me?
Yes, on the BAA actions, there were 187 residential appeals, you said, and 37 commercial appeals. Is the size of the reduction averaged over all of them? Were there several large ones? And what was your view on their actions?
I thought it was a little higher than, we had estimated 85 million. We weren't sure exactly who was going to come in this year because we did have a number of significant changes, not just from new construction, but also from the field work that we had done over the past year. That being said, I would not have thought it would have been as much as they had reduced it by. There were a couple that were large, but there was a lot that got reductions, more so than usual, I would state. Okay.
So this is at least 2 years in a row where you think their actions maybe were not based on the same data or the analysis of the same data that you've put in. I'm not sure what we do with that information, but it's certainly
That being
interesting.
said, yes.
As it relates to our budget and the mill rate calculation that we will be doing over the next few years, as you referred to, in our current estimated budget, we're reducing the grand list by $85 million.
Right.
Does that become or get reduced to the 75 million, or do you still keep some money in there for court settlements later on?
No, the
or-
court settlements are a different line item.
Okay,
Okay, so you can actually, hopefully have the final numbers to roll in tomorrow or Wednesday by the latest. So that will be the actual, you'll use that actual number for your mill rate calculation.
thank you.
Approximately 75 million.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
It's not a question, but I made a request, I hope it's not presumptuous of me, on behalf of all the members of the BET. I get periodically questions from within my caucus anyway about the settlements. Leslie Tarkington and I, who are the liaisons to the tax assessor, receive copies at our home of the letters of application from the law department to the Board of Selectmen for approval of settlements. And so I made a request, at least for the short term. You tell me whether you like receiving it or not in the fullness of time. But I've asked for the moment that copies be sent to all 12 members of the BET. So at least for a month or two, you'll have an opportunity to see for yourself what settlements are taking place and what sort of dollar figures. If that's a nuisance for you, we can always change that protocol, but I've done that for the moment.
I'd just like to add that these, are really being sent confidentially, I guess. I didn't know this was happening, but because they haven't yet gone to the Board of Selectmen for approval. These are the letters that are, or memos, or whatever one wants to call it, that are being sent to the Board of Selectmen. And Jeff and I have been receiving them as courtesy, as I think Bill Finger and I previously had. But they are, again, preliminary recommendations to the Board of Selectmen.
Thank you for that clarification. Does anyone have, yes, Mr. Deuce?
Lauren, when this goes to the Board of Selectmen, do you have a chance to offer your thoughts if the Board of Assessment Appeals perhaps comes out with something that's extreme in terms of a change?
I am not, well, I think what he's referring to is not.
I may have
the Board of
caused
Assessment Appeals.
confusion. The letters that we're receiving are letters of settlement. They're not the
From a court
results of the
appeal.
BAA.
Right.
They're settlements that are being proposed by Jean McLaughlin, acting on behalf of the town, a request for authorization of the settlements. I'm sorry, I didn't put that very well, but that's the reality.
Any further questions on the assessor's report? Hearing none, can I have a motion to accept the assessor's?
Seconded.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Mr. Raymer. All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? 12-0-0.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Menarski.
Good evening, Madam Chair and BET members. Just one quick topic I'll cover, then I'll open it up to questions. On page 1, at the request of the BET, the reimbursement update for New Lebanon, you could see we got the second one right on schedule. We're on a schedule to get them every other month. We're up to about $8.2 million. They have, to date, we've only got one submission for payment from McGill-Bain. We've paid out $921,000. So this is going well, as opposed to what happened in the past with Hamilton Avenue School and Glenville. So I'll open it to any questions on the controller's report in any other area.
I was hoping that you could provide a brief update on the Nathaniel Witherall Strategic Planning Committee RFP process.
Yes. We met last week, and the RFP, the scope of services was completed. Nancy, led by Bill Drake and Nancy Weisler, we completed the RFP at the level where the Strategic Planning Committee has involvement. It was sent to the purchasing department, and it's about a 25-page document, and the rest of it's boilerplate to make it applicable to this assignment. It's gone to purchasing, and hopefully we're getting it out this week. And I'll tell you a short story, and another, in addition to this, the Strategic Committee, at my request, we put together a group, Deborah Hess, myself, Bill Drake, and Nancy Weisler. one of the encounters, experiences I had with the actuary report was you send it out to the public. We have a list of 5 or 6 vendors, and they pick it up through the newspapers, where depending on where you advertise it. The questions come back, and they're really the unexpected. And we completed the actuary report, RFP. That's 2 actuary reports, the OPEB and the Retirement Board. We've probably put together about 100 pages of answers to the questions. So we've got a subcommittee within the strategic committee to address any. We've been empowered to address any of the questions which are going to come up from the respondents. So that's where we are right now with the RFP for the Nathaniel Witherell assignment.
Okay, Peter, and Mr. Weisbrod.
Separate question. You note that the March 16th was the Selectmen's Cash Handling Task Force met. Any update from that meeting?
The update is basically covered in the narrative here. That meeting, we're concentrating right now on the credit card area. We've drafted a credit card policy. It's being reviewed by Finance. It was drafted by the Office of the First Selectman. We've got questions, and based on the questions, we're going to have. Here's another subcommittee of the handling task force. Ben Branyan is going to meet with myself and my treasurer on Wednesday at 10 o'clock to go over updating the credit card policy. The travel policy is in the process. I'm sorry, the travel and reimbursement policy for expenses is in draft form. We haven't had a chance to review it yet at the Finance Committee. We're progressing, and the main area that we have left, let me back up. We're in the process of closing out all petty caches, and the only cash that will be out there are working funds. The difference between a petty cash is the departments can spend against it. It's an impress fund, and you have to supply the finance department with expenditure documentation to get it restored to its original price amount. And we're trying to limit it only to working funds. An example would be the assessor's office, which the BET passed a couple months ago to make change. So we're moving along, and hopefully we'll have a report for the 6-month period. It'll probably be around June. The minutes reflect from the audit committee that I haven't yet, but I'm going to invite the other 3 members to your meeting, the BET audit committee, for next month. That's the update.
Thank you.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, Mr. Minarski. You have a sentence in the retirement board section. If you could just give us some additional information. You say that the retirement board is researching the possibility of having Neuberger Berman contract directly with their own selected custodian. So I was wondering, this appears to be a new potential policy, and I was wondering if you'd had this reviewed by the law committee for compliance with the charter, or if you could just give us some more background on this particular.
To answer your question, that we're in that process, but we haven't got to the law committee yet. I'm sorry, you're not on the law committee
No,
anymore.
not on the law committee.
We
I have great faith in them.
We're reviewing it with our lawyer. If you recall, we had Ted Smoot, and we haven't gotten back to Jean and the law committee, Beth and Karen.
As a follow-on, has the town ever done this before, where they had the actual chief investment officer actually had their own custodian rather than the town having its, independent custodian?
I can't answer that because I don't have history. I only go back to 2004, but I do know that the Frank Russell firm was managing the assets, and I never looked up what the custodial arrangement was back in the 1990s. So I don't know the answer before 2004.
Perhaps
We can follow
next
up.
month you could just do, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Menarski? If not, can I have a motion to accept the
So
Controller's
moved.
report?
So-
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Mr. Raymer. All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? 1200 to accept the treasurer's report. Excuse me, the Controller's report. Moving ahead to the treasurer's report. Are there any questions regarding the treasurer's report? Hearing none, I note that the BET has received the treasurer's report and will forward it to the audit committee to be filed for review by the outside auditor. Now we move to reports from the BET standing committees. There are a couple of committee reports this evening. Mr. Weisbrot, can you provide an update on the audit committee?
Yes, as reflected by Mr. Menarski in the Controller's report, we, at the Audit Committee, accepted 2 audits, one for the town clerk, one for the septic disposal unit within Department of Public Works. Both of those audits were accepted and posted on the town's website.
Thank you, Mr. Weisbrot. Any questions on the audit committee? Okay. Ms. Crumick, can you provide an update on the law committee?
Yes, the Law Committee took up the number of resolutions that have been submitted by various parties, and we voted on the resolutions with regard to the harbor management and whether or not that provision, which had been in the list of resolutions, whether that would be taken out of the list of resolutions. We had a motion to retain the harbor management section, and it passed 2-0. We then went on to a provision that had been proposed by Mr. Raymer to include a new provision in the finance area of general government. It was with regard to the controller being authorized to assign the appropriate maturities for bonds, and we took that up, and the motion failed 2-0. We had a resolution submitted by the Senior Center, and that was to accept donations from the Friends of the Greenwich Senior Center to supplement the town-planned and appropriated interior renovation of the Senior Center. That motion was added as we amended it, and it passed 2-0. There was a provision submitted by the Police Department to authorize the apply for and receiving revenues from various areas, fines, fees, forfeitures resulting from various violations that they could then use for municipal police training. And that motion to add that failed 0-2. We then took up the motion requested by the Department of Public Works. They're seeking to authorize the acceptance of proceeds when they go out and do extra work on the weekend in order to inspect various venues for events, and they wanted to take that overtime and the proceeds that they get from that and be able to submit that to their accounts through the controller. And that motion was added as it was amended, and it passed 2-0. We took up a Board of Education request that federal government and state of Connecticut grants be accepted when they are not listed above up to $25,000. And there were 2 parts to it. The second was a non-federal government and/or non-state of Connecticut grant. Again, they wanted to include this separate provision. So in the first provision, I'm sorry, I didn't make it clear, they wanted to change from $5,000 to $25,000. In the second provision, they want to insert an entirely new provision that gives them the right to accept non-federal government and non-state of Connecticut grants up to $25,000. The motion to add both of these provisions as amended failed, 1-1. And then under additional provisions in the resolution section, there was a request to make some changes to one resolution to add an exception for certified employees under the Board of Education Table of Organization. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the material changes to that resolution, but simply state that we as a committee deferred that action.
Thank you, Ms. Cromick. Any questions on the Law Committee actions? And Mr. Raymer, can you give an update on the Policy and Procedures Committee?
Madam Chairman, because I have some motions of my own to make with regard to it, I think it might be more orderly if it suits the body that we take it up under, I'll take all of it up under old business when we reach the reference book generally.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So moving on to item 8, there are no liaison reports this evening. Item 9, there are no special project team reports, which brings us to item 10, old business, consideration and vote on the 2018 to 2020 BET reference book. With your packages, you've received proposed changes to the reference book, which have been unanimously agreed upon by the committee. Mr. Raymer, can you present those changes?
So the committee, which consists of Mr. Mason and myself, met, and we reviewed a series of proposed changes, which I had earlier sent to the BET at large, and we reviewed each of the changes. A group of the changes were approved by a 2-2 vote, and others were not approved, failed on a 1-1 vote. There has been distributed to every single member a copy of the proposed reference book, and you will find in its text various places where text appears in red. Those changes appearing in red are the changes that the Policy and Procedures Committee voted 2-2 to recommend.
Could I just clarify, 2-0, I mean?
2-0, I beg your pardon, thank you. Yeah, sorry. How many times have I said that? 2 or 3? I mean to say 2-0. I can take you through the individual changes, but I think probably you've had an opportunity to thumb through the book. I'll just mention to you in general terms that we updated the list of liaisons and special project teams. We updated the membership directory, except that it still carries a small error of reflecting that the chair is Mr. Mason, whereas I believe the chair should be reflected as Ms. Oberlander. I would ask that through Pete, if I may, that Elaine make that one further correction. We substituted the updated debt policy and the updated fund balance policy. Although it's not happened yet, approved by a 2-0 vote, the pagination is going to be changed. So instead of starting at the number 1 at the beginning of each section, which makes it hard to find your way around, the pagination will start at 1 at the beginning of the volume and run all the way through. In the Organization and Powers section at page 2, we inserted the word shall in a sentence that made the obligation to call a special meeting upon the request of 4 members, made it sound like it was permissive by using the word may, and that's being corrected. In the Organization and Powers section at page 10, it inaccurately said that it's the prerogative of the Retirement Board to approve contracts entered into with a corporation trustee. That's the word out of the charter. That should read that it's the BET that has that authorization. We inserted the word usually on page 18 of the Organization Powers to match language, coincide with language in the preceding sentence. And then lastly, we made a deletion of a sentence at page 3 of the Policy and Procedures Manual, and in each case, those are the red mark changes. At this point then, on behalf of the committee, I would move the adoption of the reference book as amended, except that I intend at the appropriate moment to move and propose certain additional changes that are not part of the consented changes of the committee.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Raymer and Mr. Mason. Are there any questions or discussion on any of the agreed-upon changes? Hearing none, I'd like to take a vote on.
Well, I would, if I may, as a point of order, Madam Chairman, I think what would be orderly then at this point would be to take as motions to amend each of the 3 amendments that I'm proposing and vote them up or down, and then vote on the manual as amended at the end of that process. I think that would be the normal way to handle it.
Well, I'd like to take an initial vote on the agreed-upon modifications,
Then I'll defer to the chair,
and then we'll take up the separate
okay, since I have no
modifications.
choice.
Yes, yes. So I'd like, all in favor of accepting the distributed and agreed-upon changes to the reference manual, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any objection? Any against? Opposed, I should say. None. Any abstentions? 0. 12-0-0 in favor of the distributed amendments. Mr. Raymer.
So I distributed to each of you a memorandum, and attached to the memorandum, just to make life confusing for you, are still more pages with still more red markings. The memorandum, of course, is mine. The red mark changes were suggested by the chair, to which I have no objection, but I might explain what you're looking at. On these pages, just the ones attached to my memorandum, the red mark changes are all the red mark changes on these particular pages that existed before, plus, in each case, there's an additional change, which is the subject of my motions, and I'll take my motions up one by one, but I wanted you to understand what you have in front of you. Again, what you have in front of you, the red markings are the changes that you just voted on and approved, but in each case, something additional, which I'll be moving. With that said, I'll make the first motion, if I may. The first motion is to the Organization and Powers section at page 18 in the 6th paragraph. And if you take a look at the first sheet that's enclosed underneath, you'll see that's a page 18. And 3/4 of the way down is a sentence which begins to read, "Items shall be added to the meeting agenda." Does everybody see that language? It is a sentence which I am proposing to be added. I have no idea why the word 10 was not also in red. It should be. But other than that, it is the language that I'm proposing to add. I'll read it in just a second, but let me describe its import. Its import is that I thought it should be part of our policy and procedures that if 4 members or more of the BET, without regard to what party they may belong to, wish an item to be added to a meeting agenda, and bring it to the chair's attention at least 10 days before the scheduled date of the meeting, the item should be added to the agenda. In providing this, it is parallel to language that already exists, which says that 4 members can oblige the BET to call a special meeting. And it seemed to me if 4 members or more can oblige there to be a special meeting to consider a matter, why cannot the same 4 members simply put it onto the agenda of a regular meeting without putting everybody the inconvenience of having to have a special meeting just to get the item heard? And so the language reads, "Items shall be added to the meeting agenda at the request of 4 members of the BET, communicated to the chair at least 10 business days prior to the meeting." And I would move that amendment.
Okay.
I'll second.
That amendment has been moved and seconded. Is there discussion on that proposed amendment? Mr. Mason?
So, not everyone here can appreciate this, but we have at least 3 chairs of boards in town, Board of Ed and BET, 1, 2, and 3 right here that have served. And I would say that Mr. Raymer's motion on a special meeting, that's for a singular item. I would say that the BET wants to be very careful. If we're going to have a person who is chair, and that person's number 1 responsibility is control of the agenda, as depicted in our charter, and having any group of 4 or more adding items, causing the material to be properly assembled, causing it to be referred to the proper committee structures, because we do work in a committee structure, is cumbersome, and there's no control there. I think we've had many times where we've had in my own error, forgot an item on the agenda, and under Robert's rules, under 2/3, we've added an item because of one of my mistakes. And I think that anybody who's chairing budget, audit, HR needs guidance. And as you know, when it comes to, and I'll bring Mr. Minarski in a little bit on this, the way our agendas and our packages work, the finance office between Peter and Elaine and Roland are constantly getting items for agendas, and there needs to be a discretion. And to do this, in my opinion, you looking for any 4 people to take over the role as chair, and I don't think that's good for the body. We are at our best serving the public when we have information, knowledge ahead of time, and communication and caucus. By doing this, who's the proponent of that? Who's this item? Do I call Karen or do I call Leslie? Who do I call on this? Who are the 4 people that are bringing this item to us? Where'd it come from? Where we have that consistency now in our chair. And I would hope everybody would vote against this amendment.
Any other comment on this proposed amendment?
I just want to add, because I think your concern about the agendas being hijacked is really how you're phrasing it. And I think in our experience, that's really not likely. That's not likely to happen. What's happened is when there is a current issue that people are concerned about and then don't feel the ability to have the airing and the discussion. I do think that Mr. Raymer's suggestion of 10 days allows these items to go through our committee structure. You're right, it is tight if there are materials that need to be gathered, but the 10 days is usually in advance of HR or Budget Committee or Law Committee meeting in order to discuss it. So I think it's worth a try. I think what it does, it gives every member on this board the ability to make sure that important issues are aired. I would like to think that we work collegially, and if timing is such that things should be delayed for a month or 2, that there's a discussion about that. But to have our policies only be that special meetings may be called in case for issues that members believe strongly need to be discussed, I think is probably, it puts another burden on this body to have to schedule another meeting and then get together.
Questions. So has, being a newcomer on the board, I'm just curious if this has been a problem in the past. It kind of feels like if we have a policy and procedure manual and it's working and there's been methods to be able to bring things up if you wanted to, why change something if you don't need to? I mean, you want to try it, but do you really need to change it? Is it necessary? You have a policy and procedure manual that has been working, and I just would question how necessary is this?
Mr. Raymer?
I mean, it is not a frequent occurrence, but it did come up a little less than a year ago. There was an item which I had felt strongly and had the support of most of my caucus. It was an item that was important to be heard. We had the option to demand a special meeting. It seemed like a needlessly provocative and melodramatic way in which to present the item. I, for one, wasn't willing to be quite that melodramatic, but it was a disappointment to me that an item wouldn't be heard. There is, under Robert's rules, as Mr. Mason very correctly pointed out, always the possibility to move at the meeting itself by a 2/3 vote to put an item on the agenda that wasn't on the agenda. And FOI makes exactly the same 2/3 provision. But the odd thing about 2/3 is it immediately says that it requires the support not only of the entire caucus of one party, but at least 2 votes out of the other caucus as well, which makes the issue unnecessarily political. And it had seemed to me that if an item is important enough that at least 4 members, not 1 member, not 2 members, but 4 members would like the matter heard, and if they have the ability anyway to cause a special meeting, why is it not perhaps more decorous to simply do it with a request, a timely request, at least 10 days before? And exactly as Mrs. Moriarty said, the 10 days was intended to allow it to go to committees without being crazy and without having it be a month before or something of that sort. And this seemed like a middle ground. But it's a judgment call. I'm respectful of the concerns that Mr. Mason has. Mr. Mason has had long experience of the chore of chair. I've never had to have that experience. I'm respectful of his point of view, but I do honestly feel that this is an important change, and I'm claiming it. I'm requesting a vote.
Mr. Mason?
I never used the word hijacked, and I never presumed that a two-thirds votes in Robert's rules would always be down party lines requiring a cross. That's an interjection you're having that's actually off base. A two-thirds vote is a two-thirds vote. It does not say a two-thirds vote primarily be one party and then two members from another. I think we've had a long-standing respect in two categories. Respect of the chair to control agendas, as all boards and commissions should. You're not applying your change to the budget committee, which you serve. So if 4 members wanted an item on the budget committee for consideration, you're not addressing that.
It is,
So,
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
I would say this again. I don't sense it on our side of the aisle for a lack of trust in the chair to control agendas. I don't see a change, okay? And I would urge all of our members not to support this change.
Just to, if I may correct? Just to correct an inadvertent misstatement by Mr. Mason, our policy and procedures manual already provides that on a 4-person committee, any 2 members may add an item to the agenda. So that language already appears in the committee structure, including for the budget committee. It only doesn't appear for the BET as a whole.
2 members of a committee.
Yes.
I agree, 100%. I agree with you 100%. But that doesn't say, what you're saying is that on our full BET member, 4 members of us can add an item to the agenda. Can those same 4 members add an item to the budget committee agenda? Under your resolution? No.
None of whom are on the committee, you're saying?
4 members of your language that you're saying.
Madam Chairman, point of order. We seem to be slipping into 2 members having conversations with each other without going through the chair. And we all know that when 2 members have conversations with each other, that we should all go through the chair and use the appropriate language of through you, Madam Chairman. And before we continue to go down this path of back and forth, I would love to ask that we bring the decorum back to where we really ought to be, and then let's continue on with the discussion.
Thank you for the point of order. Mr. Turner, were you asking that I recognize you then before you made your comment? And I'm glad, because I was hoping for the young Mr. Ferraro, we'd have a little bit of debate. So here we go. Are there further points of discussion on this amendment?
I have nothing further.
Okay, so we'll take Mr. Weisbrod.
Can I ask a question of Mr. Mason in this regard? Is that appropriate?
I'm not sure of the appropriate language, but if it's through the chair, yes, there you go.
So if there's an issue that a member wants to bring up, that if I understand it right, 4 members today under the existing rules can call for a special meeting. And what's the difference between the quote special meeting or putting something on the agenda? It seems to me a special meeting is far more burdensome and intrusive than simply, and yet it's not been used as far as I know, or if it's been used, it's rare. And so what is the practical difference between having a special meeting or putting it on the agenda, which to me is a much less intrusive alternative?
Mr. Mason, would you like to respond to that?
I don't want to speak out of order. Mr. Raymer got me in trouble when he did. So with that said, a special meeting, according to Robert's rules and our rules, is specifically designed for a singular item, okay? Meaning there's something that has come up out of the norm. It doesn't fit our meeting cycle, so it's a one subject meeting. I'll call it there's a lot of beautiful adjectives going around tonight about our discussions, but I'll keep it simple. What this is calling for 10 days in advance of only the full BET member, any 4 members wanting to put an item on the agenda, okay? It's nothing to do with a special meeting. This is just our agendas and our conduct of meetings, the information we require, our committee structure, rely on a center focal point for setting up agendas and meetings and documents and the required material, and then it's filtered down to the committee chairs to take the applicable items for those committees. This, to me, is, you've heard Mr. Raymer say it, he was encouraged to write this because last year there was something in progress and he wanted to add a meeting. He did not ask for a 2/3 vote that evening. He did not call for a special meeting, so it must not have been as important as he thought. My point is, I think you're making a change to a system that's not broke. Our system has served us well.
Any further comments on this proposed amendment? Okay, so all in favor, if you could raise your hands and I will identify by name. Okay. Mr. Turner, Mr. Raymer, I have to find you on my list here. Ms. Crumick, Ms. Moriarty, Mr. Weisbrod, and I will add myself, Ms. Oberlander. All opposed? Okay, so we have Mr. Deuce, Ms. Hess, Mr. Drake, Mr. Mason, Ms. Tarkington, and Ms. Vasiliotis. So it's 6-6. In casting the seventh vote in favor of this amendment, I recognize and I appreciate the concerns raised, particularly by the other caucus, including the fact that it is the Democratic caucus that, during my term as chair, may encourage me through 4 votes to add something on an agenda that I might not otherwise choose to put on. I do think in this instance, the interest of public discussion in the open for something where, for any 4 members, whether it be of one caucus, another, or of mixed party affiliation, 4 members wish something to be discussed, I think it is incumbent upon the chair to weigh that seriously, and in this case, to add it to the agenda. I recognize the concerns, and should we need to revisit it, I guess we will, and I understand the argument might be harder. But in this case, I'm going to vote for this amendment on a tie-breaking vote, 7-6. Mr. Mason.
I just heard you say something that I'm not sure if you understand. If 4 members request an item, it will be on the agenda. You have no discretion. The chair has no discretion anymore.
I do recognize that. Thank you for clarifying. Mr. Raymer, did you have other amendments?
I have. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have 2 other amendments. The second amendment, which appears as item B on my memorandum, but if you turn to the next page on the enclosure, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner a page 5. This happens to be page 5 out of the Policies and Practices section of the existing handbook. And you will see there 4 lines, I guess it is. One of them is only 1 word. It's 2 sentences which appear in red and are struck out. The language before the strikeout is the way it reads in the Policy and Procedures Manual right now. It was an item which was added to the Policy and Procedures Manual last time around, and it was unfortunately at that time on a party line vote. What happens here, I should probably relay back to some history. For a period of time, it was the habit at the budget meeting to entertain the departments one by one and to take a vote on each department's item. If there were amendments, we entertained the amendments first, and then at the end of the amendments, we voted on that particular department. The last 3 or 4 years, I did go back and look it up, but now I'm forgetting as I sit here whether it was the last 3 years or the last 4 years. The last 3 or 4 years, if you'll take me euphemistically there, we didn't handle things in that way. We went through and entertained motions to amend as they came up. The departments were called one by one. If there were no amendments, we just moved to the next department and it was called. If there's no amendments, we moved to the next department and it was called. If there was an amendment, we entertained that amendment, we voted on the amendment, and in accordance with an opinion from the town attorney changing prior practice, it became our acceptance that amendments could be carried on a mere majority, not necessarily 7 votes. What we didn't do at the end of each department was take a vote on each department, whether it was amended or not. These 2 sentences call for there to be a vote at the end of each department. On each department where there was an amendment. And then it does something which is odd, which is a feature of the last few words will become 0, will be 0. which was something that was added with the language along party line votes and was not part of the town attorney's opinion. And the town attorney has indicated at a law department, at a law committee meeting, that it was not part of his recommendation. He doesn't know why those words were added. The mischief of it is that if an amendment is made and then you call for a vote on the item as amended, and if there's one abstaining vote, even though 6 members may seek to pass the item, 5 oppose it, and there's 1 abstention, even though it seems to have been nobody's will, the item suddenly becomes changed to 0, and there's no appropriation for that item, not a penny. That is procedurally very strange and unnecessary. The process works if you simply delete those 2 sentences, which are marked in red and struck out. If you delete those sentences, the process will be exactly as it has been for the last 3 or 4 years, and that is that we will call the departments one by one. If there's no amendment, we'll call the next department and the next and the next. If there is an amendment, we'll vote on the amendment. Simple majority is sufficient to carry a change, and then we'll move to the next department. When all the process is done and we come to the end of the budget and the budget has been completed as amended, then will become a vote, and that vote requires 7 affirmative votes in accordance with the charter, and that's the reason for my amendment. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Raymer. I'd like to clarify, this proposed amendment came up from a question that was initially raised by one of the members about the voting procedure. There is no statutory requirement to conduct a departmental vote on the budget after an amendment, nor has that been the practice in recent years. It did leave, having this language included in the reference book, did lead to some question about whether we were following appropriate practice. Removing the language does not preclude that approach should the chair decide to take that approach to a budget discussion. So all it does is clarify that the practice that is followed is consistent with applicable rules and requirements and does not preclude taking a departmental vote should that be so desired. Are there any other questions or discussion points on this amendment? Mr. Mason? Second, Ms. Moriarty seconds the amendment.
So we talk about past budgets. Let's start off with a pretense that we, the BET, can approve the budget in any manner we would like. We can approve it one department at a time. We can approve it at the end. We can approve it any way we would like, as long as we have to send a completed budget to the RTM, 7 affirmative votes. The language in here, though, I do agree. I had read this language for a decade and then read it again after another member read it, and I said, there's an interesting point here. Mr. Raymer says that an item goes to 0 because what happens is when you amend and the amendment fails, you're amending a departmental budget. The example I think we used in committee was the law department. We want to add X amount of money to the law department. The item passes by simple majority, but now the vote for the law department as amended would come before us. Now, what Mr. Raymer is saying is, no, don't do that. At the end, you'll have your chance. So I look at it as I say to myself, and I think the town attorney, I'll use the town attorney's words. The town attorney says you may do it any way you would like. What you're doing by having the ability to do it that way, if you would like, is I love this budget. I love everything in the budget. It's just, I just can't support this law department $1 million more. I can't support it. It's that important to me. So the current, the way Mr. Raymer would like it to be is simple majority will rule. And if the item is that important to a member where they might not give the opportunity for a 7th affirmative vote for the budget, meaning the BET would, quote, fail to act, that's the only alternative. Whereas if we chose to, and I'm not saying we should, I'm not saying that. If we chose to motion to amend the law department, adding $1 million, I don't like it, but it passes on a majority. When we go to pass that department, that motion could fail not getting the 7th vote. Then what happens is that budget actually goes to 0. There can always be a motion to restore, obviously, back to the original number. But at least it gives the opportunity for 12 of us to say, okay, look, what do we We don't like this $1 million that much. What are we going to do to fix this issue? What are we going to do? Under Mr. Raymer's scenario, there is nothing you can do. You cannot not approve the law department budget. You just go to the next department, and at the end of the day, if there's that many with the simple majority, then it can create another problem with the 7th affirmative votes. I didn't support this change. Not that I think that this language was perfect. I never did when I read it after another member's interpretation of it. But I would suggest until this is what Mr. Reamer's doing here is not the fix for this, and I would vote against it.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
Just to pick up on what the chair stated, would it not be more appropriate to state something to the effect that, rather than deleting this language, that this does not preclude the BET from requiring 7 affirmative votes for the approval as part of the appropriations to be forwarded to the RTM? In the event that this procedure is adopted, failure to achieve said 7 votes will constitute a rejection, et cetera, as it now reads. That would give the BET the opportunity to at least discuss what they wish to do going forward, rather than just saying that it's this way, without any other further clarification.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understood what you're asking.
Well-
My understanding is that each member gets an opportunity to vote on a proposed amendment. Is that not correct?
Yeah, no, I'm saying that you said that the law department said that it doesn't preclude the body to adopt this very rule, for example, in looking at the various departmental appropriations.
And then let me correct that. It's not a rule.
Or whatever
It
it
does not
is.
preclude the chair in calling for a vote on the budget to ask for votes by department subsequent to amendments. So, as Mr. Mason said, and we'll go through the voting procedure on Wednesday at the budget workshop, the BET can vote on the budget any way it wants in segments as a whole, operating capital, resolution, so on and so forth, depending on the specifics of each negotiation. And in truth, your read of this provision raised the question, if that's the case, why do we have this provision that limits the practices of the BT and had not been followed?
Okay,
So-
and I guess what I'm saying is that since we can adopt that, or the chair can decide to do it that way, where we look at a departmental budget, for example, and say there are 3 deletions in that budget. Now we have a new departmental budget. The chair certainly can ask for the adoption of the budget as amended, at which point it would require the 7 votes. Why not at least state that that is a, in other words, by using my language, instead of saying the BET, the chair can require, or however you want to word it, to give us the option of doing that if that's what the body so wishes to do. By deleting this, you're basically saying that we will never do that.
No, I'm just saying that we don't have the confusing language that we're required to do it when we haven't done it in practice. So as a result, if should that be the case, where there are numerous amendments to a department budget and it is confusing to people, perhaps we will go the route of adopting by department, but we're not required to do that. And the fact that we have language in the reference, we don't need to include all the possibilities in our reference book. Our reference book is supposed to help guide us. And so since it's unnecessary and since it hasn't been followed in practice, the motion is to take it out, does not prevent us from approaching that.
Yeah, and I guess, I'm not looking at all possibilities. This is a possibility in this scenario. So I would just say that, to put in language to say that it does not preclude the BET from doing that. You don't have to use it, but we can use it.
So, and 7 votes are required for approval of the final budget, not necessarily for, you can have the 7-6 vote for the departmental
Sure.
budgets as well.
Sure,
So
and
it's not
so basically what I'm
individuals, right.
saying is that it doesn't preclude it, so why don't we just put language to that effect to say that, our normal practice is to do it by a majority vote, but it doesn't preclude us from doing it a different way.
So are you making a motion?
I don't know if we do motions to amend the motion, so
Okay.
I'd
So
rather.
then, okay, so first we'll finish the discussion on Mr. Raymer's second amendment. Are there any further comments on the second amendment? Hearing none, I'm going to call for, again, a show of individual hands on the Raymer, a motion to delete the two sentences on page 5 of policy and practices section of the reference book. All in favor, please raise your hands. Mr. Weisbrod, Ms. Moriarty, Ms. Crumick, Mr. Raymer, Mr. Turner, and Ms. Oberlander. All opposed? Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Deuce, Mr. Drake, Ms. Hess, Mr. Mason, and Ms. Vasiliotis. I thought maybe you were going to abstain.
Sorry, no, I was
Come on.
looking at my notes.
Okay. Again, that is a 6-6 vote. For the reasons that I stated earlier, I'm going to cast the tie-breaking vote in favor of this amendment to delete the two sentences. That motion has carried 7-6. Mr. Raymer.
I'm going to choose not to make the amendments that are shown as C. And D, I discovered by my error that according to the minutes of the meeting, the revision of the pagination was already included in the consented to items, so I don't need to make D. So I'm making neither C nor D unless some other member wishes to do so. And if there is no such motion, then I would ask the body to debate and act on my original motion, which is the adoption of the handbook as amended.
Ms. Vasiliotis.
Before that is done, I'd like to offer a substitute, an amendment to the motion that we just passed by including, after the words "by a majority vote, the BET will either approve or disapprove any such motion," adding, "This does not preclude the BET from requiring," or I'm not sure if it's the BET or the chair, from requiring 7 affirmative votes for approval as part of the appropriations to be forwarded to the RTM. And then followed by, "In the event that this procedure is adopted, failure to achieve said 7 votes will constitute a rejection of said appropriation, and that particular budget line item will be 0. So again, it gives the body the option of using a different procedure other than what's outlined here, but it does not require it to do so.
Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second that.
Seconded by Ms. Tarkington. Discussion?
And again, this is not meant to do all the possible scenarios that the BET might consider, but this certainly is a viable scenario that we might want to consider. And again, it's consideration. It's not saying that we have to do it. And it is consistent with the Law Department's memorandum of September 9th.
Ms. Moriarty.
Just so you understand my reasons for not supporting this, I think there are many places in this reference manual where the chair will have the option to, the manual is silent and the chair makes decision on what is appropriate based on Robert's rules and legal opinions. I find those two sentences, for those people not well-versed in BET detail, to be confusing, to understand when seven people need to support something versus 7 affirmative votes. And so I think to be clear and to recognize that the chair has the authority, I don't think their sentences are really needed to be added back to the book.
Mr. Drake.
The Scrivener's matter that Mr. Raymer asked me to bring up, which has to do with the procedure book of our policies and procedures. We adopted in November of 2016, a procedure that we all worked on, and it was adopted by a 12-0 vote, that had to do with how the BET reviewed the retirement board's investment agreements. and it got adopted. You can find it in your, you can find it in your minutes of November 21st, that it was adopted 12-0, and the chairman at the time said, Mr. Mason asked that this procedure be formatted and inserted into the BET Policies and Procedure Reference Book, and it just never physically got in there. And so when I brought that up to Mr. Mason, Mr. Raymer recently, that it was just an omission, that although it was adopted by unanimous vote, it kind of never, the papers never got copied and put in the three-ring binder, that Mr. Raymer thought this meeting would be the right time when we're circling back to and completing the handbook to bring it up.
Thank
Can
you
I
for,
just ask a point of
thank you
order?
for raising that. We'll come back to that once we dispose of Ms. Vasiliotis's motion. Are there other comments on Ms. Vasiliotis's motion to add language back into the reference guide? Hearing none, I will proceed to take a vote. Again, I'm going to ask you to show hands on the motion to add language back in by Ms. Vasiliotis, seconded by Ms. Tarkington. All in favor of adding the language read by Ms. Vasiliotis back in, please raise your hand. Okay, so we have Mr. Deuce, Mr. Drake, Ms. Hess, Mr. Mason, Ms. Tarkington, and Ms. Vasiliotis, all opposed. We have Ms. Oberlander,
They're not opposed. They're in support of the motion.
all opposed to adding the language back in. We're taking the vote of the opposed. I just took the vote of the people in favor of adding the language back in. Now we're taking the vote of people opposed to adding the language back in. Mr. Turner, Mr. Raymer, Ms. Crumick, Ms. Oberlander, Ms. Moriarty, and Mr. Weisbrod. And again, I'm getting a lot of exercise of this tie-breaking.
No, you're not exercising type.
6-6 is a fail.
Oh, 6-6, it fails. Thank you for the correction. 6-6, that motion fails. Mr. Drake, would you like to make a motion?
If you like me to make it, I'll make it, and I didn't really think it was needed to be made because it was made a year and a quarter ago and all passed, but I will if you want me to.
You're right. I will turn to the members of the Policy and Procedures Manual to comment on the suggestion raised by Mr. Drake.
First of all, I believe that Mr. Drake is entirely correct, and I think it should be a motion. I'm going to ask that Mr. Drake's comments be dealt with as a motion, which I would gladly second. And then to be more specific, protocols like that are collected in the appendix. I think the appendix would be an appropriate place for it. And just so that Mr. Drake's motion is specific, I would be pleased if he would amend his motion to say that insert the protocol in the appendix, and I would gladly second that motion.
Yeah, no, I'll make the motion the way Mr. Raymer stated it.
So we have a motion made by Mr. Drake, seconded by Mr. Raymer, to add the adopted BET policy on the review of retirement board investment agreements from 2016, I believe, November.
November 17, no?
No.
November
16?
2016.
2016, to add it as one of the adopted policies in the appendix of our reference book. Any discussion on that motion?
Madam Chairman?
Mr. Turner?
I just want to make sure that this is something that I want to confirm, this is something that the BET has previously voted on and passed, and this is really an administrative item? Okay, thank you.
Just didn't get inserted.
Yep. Thank you.
This is an administrative item, but since the new BET members have not had the opportunity to review the policy,
Right.
we will vote on this motion, and should we need to revisit this, I would ask now that there are 4 new members and 4 members can add anything to my agenda, that should there be a need to readdress it, they will make, with 10 business days' notice, the appropriate ask of adding it to the agenda.
Thank you.
Further discussion on this motion? Okay, all in favor of adopting Mr. Drake's motion, please raise your hands. And it looks like we have a unanimous vote. Any opposed? None. No abstentions? No. So 12-0-0 in favor of Mr. Drake's motion. Mr. Raymer, did you have any additional amendments?
Only that it's appropriate, sorry. Only that I believe it's appropriate at this point for the body to vote on the motion before it, which has been seconded, that the Policy and Procedures Handbook be adopted by this BET now as amended.
Mr. Mason?
I have further amendments before we get to that.
Sorry.
Under membership directory and schedule, page 2, it's in the middle of the book. There's some errors there. It still has, it corrected the word chair, but it still has me as chairman. And I do not believe it has the clerk labeled or the vice chair labeled. And I think some of these emails might not be accurate on some of the members. I would just ask everybody to check that. The one that stuck out in my mind might be Ms. Vassilotis's email. Is that accurate?
FAS or something.
And by the way, as a committee, as a full board, if you do make any changes, please notify Elaine so she can keep up with things. We don't need a committee, this is just. Page?
Under the membership section, the very first page, there's a cover sheet, so it's page 2.
So, Mr. Mason, would it be okay if I ask the board to accept any changes that an individual BET member would like to make to their specific membership information, whether it appear on the personal contact sheet or in the BET member profiles, to authorize acceptance of that and inclusion in the reference guide by extension? Okay, so I will ask each member to recheck the information included in the updated reference manual for the personal contact information. Can I just have a vote of approval that we can modify the reference guide by each member adopting their own and modifying their own information? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? 12-0-0. That motion carries. Mr. Mason, did you have any other changes?
I will have conversation on Mr. Raymer's next motion.
Okay.
But I just wanted to get
Yes. Any additional motions to amend the reference guide? Hearing none. Mr. Mason?
No, Mr. Raymer.
No, my motion's on the table.
Mr.
And it's amenable to discussion.
Can I have a point of order? We voted on the motion to adopt the changes that the policy committee proposed, and then we voted on 3 additional changes. Do we need to vote on the full book? Because we now have 4 motions on the table which are complete by themselves.
The rest of the provision, if I may respond to that, my view of it is yes. I think in the past, usually at not the organizational meeting, but our January meeting, each BET has voted on the book, adopting it. Occasionally there were changes, more often there were not. So each BET has embraced this book and voted on it affirmatively as the book that's going to govern their 2-year term. And we did not make that motion at our January meeting. We've not made that motion at all, which is the reason that I've made the motion and it's seconded and now before you. It's a motion to adopt this as being our operating protocol for these 2 years.
Mr. Mason?
So I don't agree with Mr. Raymer. I believe that the BET should not take a position that all of our policies and procedures are sort of, I don't want to use the wrong words, are null and void at the end of a term and need to be readopted at the next term. I think there's lots of items where we could say that we are a continuation of previous boards. I have not supported a couple of the amendments here. With that, I think the votes for this, I do not think we need to vote on the BET policy manual as a complete amended. I might not be able to support that vote. But the votes that have been cast so far in the amendments, I have to live with the majority rules. So I would encourage Mr. Raymer, again, back to a similar discussion. I think our policy and procedure manual was in effect. He had said that to me back when, and I said, well, I don't agree with that. I think our manual's in effect. I think we've made some amendments to it tonight, and I think it stands as is.
Mr. Drake?
Yeah, I'd like to, ask ourselves, do we think these procedures are evergreen, or are they a redo every 2 years? And, I don't know, in your heart and your mind, I could say for my part, I think they're evergreen. So I don't think we need to re-adopt them every 2 years, the whole book.
Mr. Weisbrod.
If Mr. Raymer's motion were amended to state that they are evergreen, would that be, because I think there's obviously ambiguity or uncertainty as to whether or not they are evergreen. Would that be satisfactory? Because we don't know. Are they evergreen, or do they run with every term of the BET? What question for Mr. Mason?
For me. So
I'm going to take the opportunity to do a chair's ruling at this time, and an additional motion, actually, to the reference guide. As we did similarly on the Nathaniel Witherall Special Committee, if I find that after doing additional research that we should take a full vote on the reference guide, I will certainly come back and bring it to a vote for the full BET. It is my opinion that the reference guide is intended for reference. It does not change any statutory or legal obligations that this board has, and is intended as guidance. And to the extent that there are changes in liaisons and appointments and committee structures, and indeed to clarify points of guidance, I think it's important that this board revisit it every so often whenever there is a need to update their policies and procedures. But I don't think there's a sentiment in my mind that the guidance provided goes out of existence when the one board's term ends and the next board's term starts. So for purposes of taking a global vote, I don't think at this point it's necessary we voted on the amendments. But as I said, to the extent that I find after reading Robert's rules, which would be the operative document in this case, that I need to revisit that, I will certainly come back to it. However, at this point, I would like to make a clarifying change to the preface language in the policy and procedures book, which can be found on the page following the table of contents page. And in the third paragraph, the last sentence, which now reads, "The Board of Estimate and Taxation shall vote to accept the reference book biannually in even-numbered years at its first regular meeting in January." I'd like to propose to modify that language to read, "The Board of Estimate and Tax," to delete that sentence, actually, because I think the prior sentence, "The Policy and Procedure Committee will periodically review the reference book to ensure that information remains current and recommend revisions to the Board of Estimate and Taxation for approval as needed," is the operative, what should be the operative language. And I would ask for a second, if people agree. Seconded by Mr. Mason. Discussion on that motion.
Well, the sentence sorry,
Mr. Mason was first.
So here we are this year, we had a changeover, we have 3 new people, there's 2 on your side. The reason we didn't do that is because how do you get elected, get sworn into office, usually, that was the word, in the first week of January, then you're approving a policy manual. So we did the workshop, the orientation we called it, I think we called it. And I do think there should be a formal, everybody takes a look at this, but I also think that it's almost impossible to follow what that preface says, so I think we should take that sentence out.
Mr. Raymer.
For me, it was a point I wanted to understand. So in the third paragraph, the sentence that reads, "The Board of Estimate and Taxation shall vote to accept the reference group biannually in even-numbered years as its first regular meeting in January," that's the deletion you wish to make?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Further discussion on that motion? Okay, I'd like to take, you're voting. I'd like to take a vote, all in favor of the motion to delete the last sentence from the third paragraph of the preface. Please raise your hands. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, 11 votes in favor, 1 opposed, Mr. Raymer opposed, no abstentions, 11-1, that motion carries.
Just another,
Mr. Mason. Ms. Vasilidis.
just another, I'm assuming that the November 2017 in that same paragraph will be updated as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. That will be changed to March 2018. Okay. Oh, that brings us to the end of old business. If I could find my notes and agenda. Okay. Does anyone have any new business that they would like to introduce? Seeing none, I move on to the chair's report. So I again want to thank all of the members for their cooperation this past month. A specific thank you to the staff, particularly Peter Mynarski and Roland Geiger, for their support and hard work in preparing the budget. As you know, this week, we'll be conducting a budget workshop on Wednesday, starting at 5 p.m., so that we can talk about budget concerns in an informal and collegial setting. There will be pizza for dinner, in case you, so please come hungry. The BET public hearing is scheduled for Thursday, March 22nd at 7 p.m., and the BET budget decision meeting is next Monday, March 26th, starting at 4 p.m., which is a new earlier time. In addition, there have been some changes to scheduled committee meetings. You've each received an updated calendar. Just please take a look and mark your own calendars. That's it for the chair's report. I'd like to take up the BET meeting minutes from February 20th, 2018.
No, I have a comment.
It was moved by Ms. Tarkington. Is there a second? Ms. Vasiliotis, second. Ms. Hess.
I just noted on the last page, it still lists Bill Drake as the clerk of the board.
So that was a formal motion to correct.
I think that was, that whole section has got to be taken out. I mean, I think
Okay.
Elaine
When I
left that.
print, whatever I printed today.
For some reason, it was on some of them.
Okay, the version that I have doesn't have that. We're having some quirks with our word processing, and we're working through it. Are there any other comments to the minutes? There was one addition of a word that I made in a typographical correction on page 4.
Pad number.
Under old business, in the paragraph referring to the special project team, what I have is the third line, the language, whether it would be appropriate for a non-BET, and I added in member to serve as chairman. Are there any other corrections? Ms. Krummick.
I just want to correct the name of the investment, the insurance broker, which is Frenkel, not Frankel, which will be picked up in the final. And the timing for the workshop is 5 o'clock, not 4:45, as I was originally given. So I will make that change. And I think with that, barring any Scrivener's error, we're good.
Okay, all in. Minutes adopted 12:00, which brings us to the end of our agenda.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Seconded, made by Ms. Vasiliotis, seconded by Mr. Deuce at 8:09. Thank you very much, and see you on Wednesday.